Hello, everybody. Stop me if you've heard this one before. You spend days, maybe even weeks, putting together a brand new commander deck. You pick your colors, your themes, your commander. You painstakingly, meticulously cut down to 100 cards or build up to 100 cards, depending on how you deck build. Maybe you even take your deck into a playtester and you think it feels good. Maybe you've even spent upwards of $300 on cards to put the deck together, and now you have a finished product that you are absolutely sure is the hottest shit that anyone has ever seen. Surely only a truly prodigious brewer could come up with something so brilliant. But your commander night inevitably rolls around and your deck has a few small problems, right? You're hellbent every game, it's too slow, you don't have enough interaction, your pieces never stick around on board long enough to do anything, and you don't have any way to close out the game once you actually get ahead. In other words, the deck you just made is a little bit ass. If this sounds familiar to you, it should. This is a relatively universal experience, and even Commander veterans have a tough time getting certain decks to work on the first pass. I know I do. This is a common source of frustration for people, so today I'm going to cover a few common problems and offer some specific suggestions for solving each of them. I will be focusing on issues that are applicable to most decks rather than more niche situations, since there are a fuck ton of strategies that you could be playing that each have their own deck building challenges and pitfalls. Now, let's talk about fixing your shit. First and most importantly, you gotta know when you actually have a problem. There are folks, it's me, I'm folks, who have a tendency to overreact a bit when you have a bad showing from a deck by swapping out 5 to 10 cards after every rough game. And sometimes this isn't an overreaction. One bad game can be enough to diagnose a problem, but it depends on two main things. One, how bad was the game, and two, how glaring was the issue. If your game plan was firing on all cylinders for like 8 turns and you lost out of nowhere, that's probably a good indicator that your deck works in general and you don't need to make any wholesale changes based on a one-game sample. I would call this a good loss, and we don't need to worry much about that since our ability to have fun playing the deck isn't significantly compromised. On the other hand, if you're playing a deck with 32 lands in it and the deck is not able to accommodate that land count, you will likely feel the effects of that almost immediately, and that is a bad feeling that you should absolutely act on, regardless of the sample size. I would call this a bad loss, and this is something good to keep track of since it's likely at that point that you could be having more fun if you tightened up the fundamentals of your deck a bit. For the most part, issues with your deck will require a good chunk of dedicated playtest time or at least a couple of games to properly diagnose, but I just wanted to highlight that there are some edge cases where your problem and its solution will be obvious. A good rule of thumb I try to follow is to only react to individual games if I did not enjoy playing the deck mechanically. This could apply to a win or a loss, and this just means your deck didn't do what you wanted it to do, or if it did, the thing you thought you wanted ended up being cringe, or it's not the first time that I lost a game in a particular way. If I'm playing a deck that relies heavily on the commander, and I can't stick my commander 2 out of 10 games because my friends hate me, that's absolutely fine in my opinion, well within the margin of error. If that's happening consistently though, that's when you need to take action. Obviously, you can't eliminate adverse situations in Commander, that's true of life in general, but a well-made deck can limit those occurrences in the aggregate. How you go about doing that will depend on the specific problem your deck is facing, and I will talk about some of the ones I see frequently along with some potential solutions, starting with something that's a little bit esoteric but still really important: a consistent lack of agency. This can happen when your deck lacks the tools it needs to meaningfully impact the game in certain situations. For example, if you're playing a deck built almost entirely around creature ETBs, and someone plays a Torpor Orb, if you have no artifact removal that isn't tied to a creature ETB, you are, for lack of a better word, fucked, and will not be able to do anything fun ever again for the rest of the entire game. This is, of course, bad, because being able to do stuff is directly correlated to how much fun you will have at the table. To remedy this issue, you want to understand your deck's weaknesses and try to bring at least a few ways to answer things that can ruin your game. Sticking with the Torpor Orb example, rather than bringing another creature that enters the battlefield and destroys an artifact, you could instead bring something like Cathar Commando that is still cheap and efficient, but also gets around the Torpor Orb. I am also going to stump just a little bit for generic versatile interaction right now. Now, I get it, right? This is the unsexiest shit ever. This is more likely than not a 3-mana instant that is extremely flexible but has no synergy with the rest of your deck. And while we all understand why 1-for-1s feel bad in Commander, these cards like Chaos Warp, Beast Within, and Generous Gift aren't just removal. It's really better to think of them as a one-size-fits-all tool to help you deal with any permanent that could be causing you to have a non-game. Are you under an Overwhelming Splendor on a creature deck? Beast Within. Are you under a Winter Orb? Beast Within. Is the Glacial Chasm player being such a little shit? Beast Within. You get the picture. It's not a super niche pick that makes you feel like a genius, but it does increase your odds of eventually getting to do the super niche thing that will make you feel like a genius. Very important for maintaining your agency. Tutors can also help contribute to a sense of control in your gameplay, especially as part of a toolbox package. Being able to pull multiple equally good options out of your ass is really satisfying and makes sure you'll never feel helpless, which is a really big deal as far as agency is concerned. The next common problem I see is the inability to get through the library. This could be shorthanded to a lack of card draw, but this is a very diverse format, so it's actually a whole lot deeper than that. The truth is, not every deck needs a ton of pure draw. Looting and rummaging aren't card advantage, but they do help quickly get to the card you need when you need it, which is the whole point of drawing a shit ton of cards in the first place. The same is true of self-mill. You can often mill yourself a lot quicker than you could draw through your deck. Impulse draw and funky Flame War style milling into exile effects also apply here. Point being, the solution to your deck's poor card velocity is not necessarily to jam in 3 to 4 more pieces that just say draw a card on it. Don't get me wrong, there is a time and place for that, but generally speaking, the way that your deck gets more cards should have something to do with the deck's goals and aspirations. Obviously, this is one where I can't give advice that's too specific because there are a million decks that do a million different things, and many of those decks want different card draw pieces. But there are some guidelines that have helped me smooth out the draw suites in my decks. Generally, I start with 12 pieces of card draw. You might need more or less depending on what your deck is or what your commander does. If your commander is going to draw you 10 cards over the course of the average game, you can probably afford a bit less card draw, whereas Spellslinger and Landfall decks are going to need a whole lot more since they struggle to keep a steady supply of cards. In my experience, Commander is a format that rewards extremes for the most part, so I gravitate towards pieces that are going to draw a whole bunch of cards, either one at a time through triggers that are easy to get, or through one-off big spells that refill the entire hand in one shot. I've shown some examples of each on screen here, but this same principle could also apply to sources of card advantage that have nothing to do with drawing cards. As an example, Flame War gives you cards for each point of damage it deals, and the cards go into an uninteractable pile that you can access at any time. So in that case, shit like Improvised Arsenal and Wrecking Ball Arm that quickly crank Flame War's power are card draw. And in this case, 1 or 2 decent attacks over the course of games can get you more cards than like 8 Sign-in Bloods. Another wacky personal example, if you have Grolnok out and you traumatize yourself and you don't get blown out like I did a few weeks ago, fuck you Kevin, you now just have access to half of your library for the rest of the game since it gets milled into exile with Grolnok's ability. When it comes to draw engines that are reusable, Beast Whisper type shit, these are obviously great to have since they typically synergize with whatever your deck was already doing, but you just want to be careful that your deck is not overly exposed to card draw that only works when you're executing on your game plan. I've definitely run into problems with this in some of my decks where the deck has plenty of card draw, but all of that draw is contingent on one or more things going right on my side of the board. This can leave you in a really awkward spot where your card draw spell just sits in your hand or even on the battlefield as you fail to do anything at all over the course of multiple turns. This is another instance similar to Interaction where having at least a couple of more generic options can help you get unstuck and bridge the gap until your game plan starts working. Moving on to a less discussed but still extremely relevant issue. You ever just get beat to death? Are you ever just plugging along on turn like 4 or 5 of a Commander game and you realize that you're already down to 25 life because everyone else played a creature every turn and you didn't, and they swung at you and beat your ass because you didn't have any blockers? This is something I see frequently with Voltron decks prior to the Commander being played, Spellslinger decks, and just decks with a lower than average creature count in general. There are plenty of relatively simple fixes for this. You just need to pick the ones that make sense for your deck. If there are death touch creatures in your color identity that are either generically good or work well within your strategy, these can solve the problem single-handedly, especially flying death touchers like Baleful Strix. If you've ever played one on turn 2, you know that shit is basically a force field. People are not going to spend removal on this because it feels terrible, and they really don't want to attack into it either because that feels even worse. So you kind of just get to skate on through most of the time. Similarly, Silent Arbiter has some really great use cases, especially in the Voltron context. You are likely to be much better at attacking than your opponents will be at blocking, so you get the benefit of taking away the option of them blocking with multiple creatures, and then you also get to limit how hard they can hit you back since only one creature will be able to attack you. There are also a ton of pillow fort effects in several colors that you can chuck into your decks that can stop people from attacking you altogether. Even just making some creature tokens at some point along the way can be enough to deter some amount of aggression. You just want to make sure that you have some way to protect yourself from early combat, stay safe out there and all that. The last issue I'm going to troubleshoot is also one of the most universal: deck too slow. We've all felt this at some point or another. Your deck just barely has the time to actually fire up before you lose to someone who got set up like 2 full turns before you, which sucks. Now, the vast majority of the time, I like to try to play my commanders at least a turn early, and if the deck I'm playing really doesn't give that much of a shit about the commander, then I usually have some amount of mana that I'm trying to get to by a certain point in the game on average. Now, in my decks and other people's decks, I typically see a number of ramp pieces between 8 and 16. 8 being on the low end, with the decks typically being slower on purpose or just less mana hungry, and 16 being on the high end, with decks being faster, more mana hungry, or always wanting to cast their commander on a particular turn. For example, if you have a 4 mana commander that you really want to put in play on turn 3 most of the time, you may load up on 2 mana ramp pieces even if the rest of your deck doesn't actually need that much, just to make absolutely sure that you're able to get your guy consistently. As with most things in Commander, specificity is a very powerful tool. Getting your ramp package dialed in is really going to depend on what you're trying to do, but a good rule of thumb is that if you want to regularly hit a certain mana threshold in your games, you're going to want to have a higher concentration, probably 8+ pieces, of cards that specifically get you to that number. Going back to the prior example, if you know that you always want to cast your 4 mana commander on 3, you're going to get a hell of a lot more mileage out of Arcane Signet or Nature's Lore than you would out of Cultivate, because Cultivate does not actually accelerate you into casting your commander since it's 3 mana, making it a lot less impactful than it would be if your commander was 5 or even 6 mana. If you're finding that your ramp package doesn't feel very good, it might be worth taking a step back and thinking about whether or not your ramp is meaningfully helping you cast your spells. It's also worth spending some time, I think, on ways that we might address these issues early on in the deck building process. This is especially important for those of you that actually buy your cards, which is not me, by the way. Your boy ain't got it like that, though I could in the future if you got a channel membership. But seriously, proxying a deck to see if you actually want to buy it or not can be a great way to make sure that you don't waste your money on some bullshit. Thorough playtesting can also help tremendously with this problem, not just doing some sample hands, but actually going into the Architect, Moxfield, Commander Template playtester and thoughtfully playing out 6 to 8 turns, specifically looking for things about your deck which don't work. I like to run out batches of 10 or so playtests at a time, each time noting what I didn't like. If you notice a consistent theme, then you can safely assume that there's a problem there that's worth fixing. That's just about everything that I wanted to cover here. Let me know any other common issues that I missed. Obviously, this video is not comprehensive, so I'm sure there are plenty of other ones worth discussing. As always, please like and hype the video if you liked it, and subscribe to the channel for more magical yapping. And in the meantime, this has been Very Bad Deck Techs. I have been Jared, and I will see you all in the next one. Stay safe out there.